Housing Action Coalition, and this event, as part of HAC, is a series of monthly discussion-based, action-focused events that's hosted by Silicon Valley at Home, which we typically have on the fourth Friday of every month, but today it's on a Thursday. And this is meeting style on Zoom by design. Usually it's in person, so we're going to try to capture the feeling of meeting in person as much as possible. So in that spirit, we do encourage you to keep your video on if you're able, to create as much of a community dialogue as much as possible. And a few ground rules. We'd like to ensure that the conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. So we do ask that you are kind and courteous to each other. We will not tolerate rude comments or personal attacks. And we encourage asking questions and listening. We think both are active components of learning and engaging with each other. And we also know that sometimes the chat can get pretty lively. So if you find that it's distracting you from the content of the discussion, we encourage you to consider maybe closing the chat temporarily and come back to it if you need to. And please remember that today's conversation is focused on fair housing and the housing elements. So remember to keep questions and comments on topic. So with that, I will hand it over to Matthew.
Great. Thank you so much, Yuju. And thank you everybody for coming. I see people are still trickling in. We're very excited today to talk about the housing element, and particularly the role of fair housing and affirmatively fair housing in the process that we're all, whether we're engaged directly or not, we're in the middle of here in Santa Clara County in the South Bay, and actually around the Bay Area. Housing element process happens every 8 years. There are some things that are different about this cycle, and one of them is the inclusion of much more robust discussions of fair housing and some real clear guidance from state law and from the housing community development about how this needs to be working locally in order to both pursue the interests that we all have as a community, but also to be in conformance with state law. So we have two great folks who have agreed to come and share their wisdom and knowledge and energy with us. Let me start by introducing Kelsey Bain, who is the Regional Director for the Peninsula and South Bay at YIMBY Action, and is a key driver of a regional campaign around housing element advocacy. We will hear from her second. And Thomas Silverstein, who is the Associate Director of Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And Thomas has been engaged in fair housing assessment work here in Santa Clara County for, I don't know how many years now, but recently enough that he's an expert in our region. So with that, let me turn it over to Thomas to give us some background on what the structure is that we're all working under now with the fair housing and the housing element. Thank you, Thomas.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthew, and thanks to everyone for joining today. It looks like we have a really good crowd. So as Matthew mentioned, I have been doing fair housing planning work in Santa Clara County for about 2 years now, and just sort of so everyone understands sort of my position in all of the different sort of pieces of the puzzle. My organization has been consulting for about 2 years with the county and through the county with the County Housing Authority, as well as the cities of San Jose, Santa Clara, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, Palo Alto, Cupertino, and Gilroy. And then we also more recently began working with Milpitas. And through our work with the county, that we are also, the county sort of includes the urban county for purposes of the administration of the home and CDBG programs. So some of the analysis we've done for the county addresses the other cities in the county. The work that we've been working on now for 2 years originally was intended to be responsive to the county and these quote unquote entitlement cities and the public housing authority's obligations under federal law as recipients of HUD funds. So HUD has had regulations governing the duty to affirmatively further fair housing now for over a quarter century. And there was a lot of regulatory change during the Obama administration. And one of the key things that happened during the Obama administration was the promulgation of something called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule in 2015. And it was through that rule that HUD created the assessment of fair housing process. When the 2016 election happened, it was clear from very early on that the AFFH rule of the Obama administration was in the sort of crosshairs under the leadership of President Trump and Secretary Carson. And in California, as a reaction against that sort of impending threat to affirmatively furthering fair housing, the legislature passed AB 686, which going forward, amongst other things, incorporated an assessment of fair housing obligation into the housing element process. When we began working with Santa Clara County, the federal threat had already materialized, and at that point, although HUD was still telling jurisdictions that they had to do some fair housing planning, they had reverted back to what was called the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice under a 1995 regulation. But seeing that the state had passed AB 686, the jurisdictions in Santa Clara County, or most of the jurisdictions in Santa Clara County, began working on something that was modeled after the federal assessment of fair housing, because they knew that they would have to do an assessment of fair housing shortly anyhow, namely for this housing element that's going to come due in 2022. So the work that's been done over the past 2 years has really focused on the assessment of fair housing template. But there's some important other things to know. So one is that the California Housing and Community Development, building off of the content of AB 686, didn't just wholesale adopt the federal assessment of fair housing from the Obama administration and make no sort of tweaks or adjustments. So there are a few key things. So by statute, an enhanced discussion of displacement and displacement risk is incorporated into the assessment of fair housing in California. So that's the one key sort of different piece. And that is, really a reflection of conditions that exist in California, that exist in some other parts of the country, but don't exist everywhere. And thus, HUD may have been disinclined during the Obama administration to say that you would need a displacement analysis in like a really cold, low demand real estate market where there may not be much displacement risk. So they didn't want to have that sort of one size fits all approach, but in California, displacement is obviously a sort of top of mind concern. The other really important piece to highlight that was incorporated by statute in AB 686 is that the analysis that's in the assessment of fair housing has to inform the sites inventory analysis in the housing element. So there has to be this logical connection between the two. So that means that if your substantive analysis in your assessment of fair housing shows, these are the areas that have high performing schools, that also have good transit access and have low concentrations of poverty and all of these different features. And then you have a sites inventory analysis that ignores all of this sort of access to opportunity analysis, that there would be a sort of a disconnect there and things wouldn't add up from HCD's perspective and also in light of the statute. The last thing I'll say about the content of AB 686 is that it's important to be aware of how AB 686 fits into the broader structures of California law. And caveat, I'm not providing any legal advice, and I am licensed to practice law in a bunch of different places, but not California. But California has a sort of procedural mechanism under the law called an administrative mandamus action. And the way in which AB 686 fits into California law in general, in theory, allows a violation of AB 686 to be judicially enforceable in court via an administrative mandamus action. And that is very different from the federal legal landscape around HUD's affirmatively furthering regulations, which essentially were not privately enforceable in any meaningful way. So what do we have going forward in California? We've got a displacement analysis that's over and above what you had under federal law. You've got the clear logical connection to the sites inventory analysis, and you've got a little bit more enforcement teeth and risk that if a jurisdiction doesn't do what it's supposed to do, that there could be some consequences on the back end. The other thing I'll note, which I think is quite important, is that under AB 686, the obligation to do this assessment of fair housing is not linked to the HUD funds. So that means that jurisdictions that do not receive HUD funds still have to do an assessment of fair housing. So for some jurisdictions, that's going to be a really new process. For HUD entitlement jurisdictions, they have gone through potentially, 5-6 iterations of analyses of impediments to fair housing choice over the course of a quarter century. This may be more rigorous than what they've done in the past, but in some ways it looks like what they've done in the past. But for jurisdictions that are not entitlement jurisdictions, not HUD grantees, this is a new process. I think the other sort of pieces to stress in opening are that there's a lot that's coming out that isn't directly from the statute for AB 686, that's coming out through HCD guidance that jurisdictions are going to have to sort of rapidly adjust to, and that advocates will want to sort of ground themselves in as well, in terms of types of data that HCD is expecting jurisdictions to look at, and types of analysis that it is expecting jurisdictions to look at. So for instance, there's a required analysis now, or sort of either required or strongly suggested analysis now of racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence. This is sort of the flip side of the HUD rules focus on racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. Racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence are what they sound like. The decision to include them was based on some research done by sociologists at the University of Minnesota. But this is a new thing that's being included for the first time. There are other sort of data sets that HUD would never have included because they aren't nationally available in a uniform way, but that HCD is directing the consideration of. So that will result in a sort of more robust base of data being considered in the assessment of fair housing component of the housing element that you would have seen in the federal plans previously. But with that said, probably something on the order of 85 to 90% of the data in a sort of California approved assessment of fair housing would be the same as in a HUD plan that's done consistently with the 2015 HUD rule. Last thing I'll say is that there are some regions of the state that are ahead of the Bay Area in terms of the implementation timeline. So we have started to see, coming out of the Sacramento area, out of Southern California, I think also out of Fresno, that jurisdictions have completed their housing elements and submitted them and are starting to get feedback on them from HCD. And the review process by HCD suggests that there is a degree of rigor being applied to the review that is probably more intensive than what folks saw from HUD in the past, and certainly than anything that folks would have seen from HUD in the past 4 years. So whereas in a lot of past fair housing planning processes, it was normal for jurisdictions to say that they were going to study or consider taking some future step rather than saying that they were going to take some future step. HCD is now looking quite unfavorably on goals or strategies for the future that involve studying or considering something rather than sort of taking the next step and actually implementing. So that's one thing that we sort of know so far. And I think it will be interesting to see how some of the jurisdictions that are ahead of the Bay Area in the sort of pipeline actually revise their submissions now that they've gotten some critical feedback from HCD. So I hope that sets the table a little bit, Matthew, and I'll sort of turn it back to you and to Kelsey.
It does. Great, Thomas. We're going to have an opportunity for a little bit of back and forth between Kelsey and Thomas, and before we open it up for questions. But let me turn it over to Kelsey to talk a little bit about the work that she's been doing locally or regionally, and how it fits within the framework that Thomas laid out.
Yeah, great. So I will just briefly reintroduce myself. My name is Kelsey Bain. I am the Regional Director for EMB Action. And we are doing a membership drive this month. So I just want to plug that if you join or donate to YIMBY Action this month, you'll get a really cool legalized housing t-shirt. So I will drop that in the chat. But I also want to say that YIMBY Action, along with SV at Home and many other partners, are part of this, what we're calling a campaign for fair housing elements. It's a statewide coalition of organizations that are doing advocacy and enforcement around this issue of fair housing elements during our upcoming housing element cycle. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to fairhousingelements.org to learn more about the coalition. But what we're doing with this campaign is really advocating for cities, towns, and counties to be actively planning to have diverse housing options that are accessible to people of all backgrounds, all abilities, all incomes, and really using these principles of fair housing to craft policy. And as you already heard from Thomas, there have been some recent changes in law that could be really powerful in terms of really pushing our local jurisdictions to actively dismantle patterns of segregation. In Silicon Valley, we certainly see very stark segregation. We can think about the segregation that we have in our communities as certainly there are examples of within jurisdiction segregation. So if you look at San Jose, on the east side of San Jose, you see kind of concentrated areas of poverty, concentrated Latinx communities that have been disinvested in or have less access to resources. So kind of what Thomas already talked about in terms of what has been termed recap, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. But we also certainly have lots of exclusionary jurisdictions and many racially concentrated areas of affluence. And I think it's important to note that HCD is expecting jurisdictions to not just consider segregation within their jurisdiction, but to consider segregation within the region. Something that we saw with some Southern California jurisdictions is cities saying, you know, we don't have segregation here, everyone here is white. So there are no patterns of segregation. So you need to think about within the broader region, what the patterns of segregation look like. And if you are a concentrated area of affluence, to think about how to open up your city to people of varying income levels and races. So some of the things we're going to be looking for when it comes to fair housing in terms of the advocacy piece, I would say kind of the foundation is pushing for diligent and equitable outreach. We know in terms of who tends to show up to the average government meeting. So, you know, cities will put on a community meeting to talk about the housing element. Maybe now they would do it in a webinar format. But the people who tend to show up to meetings like that are older, wealthier, white. They're more likely to be men, and they're more likely to be people who are stably housed, who are getting their housing needs met. And that's going to influence the type of information you get. So cities need to be doing really active outreach to make sure they are reaching underrepresented groups. So to make sure you're reaching renters, people of color, people with disabilities, like outreach to people with disabilities in particular is something that we are definitely going to be advocating for, and cities are going to be expected to do. Another aspect of this is kind of thinking about the format of the meeting, because we have seen in other jurisdictions, so I can give the example of in San Mateo, they did a community meeting in Spanish, which is great, but no one came. So like just providing the translation, if you're using that same format, that maybe doesn't work for working people who have multiple jobs, is not going to be sufficient. You really need to think about more kind of targeted forms of outreach. So if they're trying to reach an undocumented community, how to go about that. So maybe it means reaching out to the day center and connecting with them. But to think more, so we're seeing cities doing things like pop-ups, and I think those are good, but we also need to see more targeted outreach and connecting to community organizations that provide services to those communities who you're trying to reach. So that's kind of the foundation, I would say, is the more equitable outreach process. And that outreach process can really inform the assessment of fair housing and the program and policy making. So when we think about the assessment of fair housing, what we're looking for cities to do is to look at their history, to look at their patterns of segregation, like I said, not just within the city, but also within the region, to also like evaluate how past programs performed. And certainly by talking to the communities who are most impacted by the housing crisis, you can get a better sense of how you're performing as a jurisdiction. And then when we get into what kinds of programs we would like to see, we can think about opening up those concentrated areas of affluence to more kinds of diverse housing types. So things like duplexes, apartments, and really specifically zoning for housing that will be accessible to affordable developers. So creating opportunities for by right development for affordable housing and reducing kind of onerous zoning requirements on height and density and parking, things that prevent affordable housing from really even being considered. And part of opening up exclusionary areas means having opportunities throughout the city, and most importantly in areas that have really high quality schools and high quality services, things like grocery stores. So then I would say the kind of flip side of opening up those exclusionary areas is also really investing in communities that have previously been disinvested in the concentrated areas of poverty, to make sure there is, you know, community infrastructure like parks, targeting programs for preserving housing, and doing things like tenant protections, particularly in areas that are at high risk of displacement. Providing funding for affordable housing would be a big part of this. And then providing funding or just proactive measures to help both tenants and homeowners in maintaining and rehabilitating houses. And then also providing tenant counseling, foreclosure assistance, and in multiple languages, kind of tailored to the people in the community. And then kind of the last bucket of kind of policies that I'm going to address in my comments is thinking about the needs of kind of special populations, people with a disproportionate need for housing. So thinking about kind of preventing displacement and homeless prevention by thinking about including programs for people who are having severe cost burden. So this could be things like rental relief, or thinking about populations that are living in overcrowded conditions. So certainly affordable housing would factor into responding to this, but we've also seen cities do things like red tag ordinances so that tenants who are living in really overcrowded conditions and kind of being taken advantage of by their landlord would have, you know, some relocation assistance to move away. But this could look like a lot of different things. Targeted programs, I think listening to the community would be the best approach. And similar to overcrowding, kind of thinking about areas where there maybe are substandard housing conditions. And that could certainly be informed by code enforcement, and then also thinking about just people who are experiencing homelessness in the community. Santa Clara County has the community plan to end homelessness, and I think that's a really good guide for cities in terms of what policies and programs are good for addressing homelessness. But so I kind of covered a lot of different things, but just want to say that kind of where we see our role in this process is really in enforcement of these laws. So we want to make sure that jurisdictions know their responsibility. We want to get more people engaged in this process. And we want to be auditing housing elements that are coming out to say whether or not they are complying with the law. And I think we have a really great moment in time with these new laws in place. I think there's a lot of energy, but there's also a lot of work because we have so many disparate jurisdictions. So yeah, it's going to take some organizing. I'll put a couple more links in the chat if you're interested in signing up for the campaign, either as an individual or if you're part of an organization that is interested in getting involved housing element work, and it would be helpful to you to have technical assistance or just to be part of a community of advocates who are doing this work. I will add those links in the chat.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey and Thomas. Let me just, if I could take us to a slightly higher level, I'm gonna guess that the majority of folks that tuned in today have been thinking about the housing element, if they've been thinking about it at all, as a challenge of figuring out how to plan for a ton of new housing in cities throughout the county. And some other group is going to know that, you know, roughly half or a little more than half of those new homes are supposed to be affordable to folks with lower incomes. Can we talk just a little bit about how the general goal of creating, you know, and expanding housing opportunities fits into the fair housing pieces? I think the connection is clear in terms of implementation, but we've been so focused on the large numbers, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how they fit together.
I can speak a little bit to this and kind of situate the question to some extent in the legal framework, although try to do it without sounding too much like a law professor. It's important basically to keep in mind that fair housing and affordable housing are related concepts, but not identical concepts. You know, the Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, although especially the Fair Housing Act, does not treat income level or economic status as a protected class. The one wrinkle there is now under California Fair Employment and Housing Act, you have source of income as a protected class, but income level itself, absent having a voucher or some other form of tenant-based rental assistance, or, you know, having income derived from disability, et cetera, is not actually a protected class in and of itself. So it's always been the case, and this has been reinforced by a few different court decisions, including a really important case from back in 2009 involving Westchester County, New York, that you have to look at more than just housing affordability in order to ensure that your housing production efforts actually connect to the goal of furthering fair housing. So there's a few things analytically from a planning perspective that go into that. One is you need to look carefully at the correlations that exist between protected class status, especially race, but not exclusively race, and socioeconomic status. You know, if you just assume without looking, then you may, find yourself sort of led astray in certain circumstances. So you want to be grounded in data that substantiates and shows you some of the nuances of those correlations. You also want to make sure that you're paying attention to the location of housing. So this was something that was key in this Westchester County case I mentioned, is you're looking at where are you producing housing against these patterns of segregation that exist currently. And that doesn't mean that all new affordable housing has to go into predominantly white areas where it would further integration. You can have a balance of multiple sort of complementary goals in terms of anti-displacement and community revitalization at the same time, but you have to at least be mindful of how location and patterns of segregation interrelate with your production efforts. And then the last thing is you need to make sure that when you produce affordable housing, that members of protected classes actually are able to access that housing. So I think one thing that is a sort of nationwide phenomenon, certainly exists in California as well, is that sometimes when you break through and you actually get affordable housing developed in higher opportunity communities, despite some of the higher barriers to doing so that exist, it's more likely to be senior housing than family housing. And that is, another thing which you have to sort of address on the front end. Another piece is the affirmative marketing side of things, which sometimes is not the most, the most glamorous piece, but the marketing really matters. If you have housing that's even family occupancy housing that's being produced in higher opportunity areas, but it's only being marketed to existing residents of those communities, for instance, as housing for, the sort of adult children of longtime residents, which is often a way of making, from a sort of political marketing perspective, is a way of making the affordable housing seem more palatable. That obviously doesn't get at those underlying fair housing goals. There's a lot more to be said on the topic, but that's initial thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much other than, reflecting on what Thomas just shared. I'm just thinking about how it seems like this is going to require ongoing advocacy beyond, just the submittal of the housing element, but we're going to have to watch how these programs are actually implemented and whether or not they're implemented in a fair way.
So Kelsey, would you say that some of these expectations are kind of barriers for cities trying to figure out how to get through the planning process? Are there ways that they, we can see them as positive opportunities to kind of realize cities' goals? Or it's been a very adversarial space, and it's not so much cities versus communities. It's kind of communities versus communities with the cities as a go-between, and it's just been difficult. So I know you've been looking at this closely. I'm wondering if there's a sort of an upside of some of the requirements that can improve the process as you see it.
Well, certainly. So HCD released their Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing guidance. And from a housing advocate perspective, particularly the section on kind of barriers to development, which are barriers to affirmatively furthering fair housing, but having them framed as, these are barriers to affirmatively furthering fair housing, that height limits are a barrier to affirmatively furthering fair housing, or, onerous parking requirements, that I think that might be helpful to advocates to kind of frame the discussion in that way, and to be able to bring up the HCD guidance, that's really part of what we should be looking at. I think might be helpful. I'm not sure if I got at the intent of your question, but that's where my mind went.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I think, part of the challenge is figuring out how to explain to communities what the process is that cities are going through, and some of it is complicated and hard to access, but at some point there's going to be a map and there's going to be a bunch of policies that are going to have to be submitted to the state, that the community is going to have to process. And so I think what you pointed out is that there are ways in which the fair housing requirements end up creating a good explanation and foundation for some of the other planning land use decisions that cities are going to have to make, and it helps to provide a context for what that final document looks like. We're hearing a lot lately about the fact that local control is being stripped away, and all of these new state requirements are making things hard on the ground, and taking power away from communities. And Thomas, I just wanted to open it up to you in terms of thinking about the the question of how communities can sort of engage, and I'll open this up to both, can engage in a way that that does give them space to act and have a voice and have local perspective within this process and still be conforming with the law and the state expectations.
Yeah, so, you know, there's, in terms of community engagement, you know, there's sort of different layers going on here simultaneously. So you're going to have the housing element process itself, which includes an assessment of fair housing component and is subject to its own engagement requirements. But also simultaneously, the HUD grantees in the county are still going through a process, some of which will be sort of ported over to some extent into the housing element that is subject to its own set of community engagement requirements, consistent with each jurisdiction's what's called in the HUD parlance citizen participation plan. You know, that terminology notwithstanding, obviously the goal is certainly to engage with all residents regardless of citizenship status. In terms of the HUD piece, because in many of these communities, the HUD piece may be moving a little bit sooner and faster than the housing element piece. You know, when there is a sort of a draft ready for public review, the typical HUD community engagement process requires for local governments at least a 30-day public review period with at least one public or community meeting during that period. HUD has never had a preference or a particular view on whether the meeting that takes place during that period has to be a formal public hearing in the California sense before the sort of city council or county board of supervisors, or whether they can be, you know, sort of more of just an open forum for members of the public to express their views. There are sort of pluses and minuses to both approaches. But that's the sort of main formal opportunity to weigh in on a sort of HUD process fair housing plan. With that said, you know, as you know, based on what I've said on this call, and you may have previously been aware of, you know, some of this work is ongoing, drafting work is ongoing. You know, if you, and I'm not suggesting, and if there are any folks who administer home and CDBG at the city level or county level who are on this call, don't get mad at me for saying this, because your inboxes get full, but like, you can, as a member of the public, you can engage, you know, with your local government and, you know, express your views regarding what should be in a fair housing plan that you know to be, you know, in the works. In the meanwhile, you don't have to wait for a draft to be publicly available and out there. And in some ways, the odds of your perspective being addressed through a fair housing plan are higher the sooner you get your input in, because it becomes harder to make changes the further things sort of get baked in. So, you know, yes, expect there to be a formal public sort of review process consistent with your jurisdiction's citizen participation plan. But in the meanwhile, if you have, you know, thoughts, engage with the people who you know sort of administer these programs at the city level. If you have questions about this in general, you can certainly reach out to me, since I'm working with so many of the different jurisdictions here. If I'm not a correct person to be contacted, I can at least try to point you in the right direction. The other thing I'll just note in terms of some of the HUD process that's been underway for 2 years is there was quite a bit of heavy community engagement that was done in late 2019 and very early 2020, right before the pandemic. I think there's a recognition that, you know, sometimes things get a little stale over time, and obviously the pandemic kind of put a wrench in a lot of people's plans. But there was some engagement done earlier on that's helping to inform the work on an ongoing basis. I'll leave it at that for now.
No, that's great. Kelsey, I think in some ways, Thomas is saying that what you all and what we are sort of trying to do of helping to facilitate engagement, sort of whether it fits with an established process or not, Sounds pretty important. And I think we've talked to cities, and there's just a, some of it is a staff capacity issue. How many public meetings can we hold? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what folks are doing locally to try and engage people more proactively and earlier in the process.
Yeah, so in terms of what advocacy groups are doing, so I'll give a shout out to Cupertino for All. I think they're doing a housing element event on October 13th. Cupertino is getting started a little bit later than some other cities in the county, so they're getting ready to kick off their process. They just hired a consultant. And what Cupertino for All is doing is they're hosting an event with, I'm blanking out on the organization, something community service, West Valley Community Services. So they're doing an event with West Valley Community Services and really trying to bring people in and kind of change hearts and minds to recognize the importance of getting engaged and affirmatively furthering fair housing, but also just having more homes in a place like Cupertino, which is a huge job center. Something that we've done with Palo Alto Forward is, so the situation in Palo Alto is such that the city convened a housing element working group, which I think most housing advocates would say that's a good thing to do, to convene a diverse working group. But the city very purposefully kept housing advocates off of that working group, many of whom were renters. So the outcome of that working group is, the people who really have a voice on the working group are the same old people. It's the homeowners who the city would hear from anyway if they hadn't convened a working group. So what we have done is we're having watch parties. So people can join our watch party and we'll kind of chat about what's going on. People can ask questions, but it's a way to kind of get people involved in doing the oversight work when we weren't allowed to have a seat at the table. I would say a better model of working group that I'm seeing play out outside of Santa Clara County is in Menlo Park. They've convened a working group that is specifically about community engagement. So the members of the working group are meant to kind of think about equity and think about how do we reach out to different members of the community, and also to be ambassadors about the housing element to the community. And I am seeing some interesting conversations and outcomes come out of that process. So that has been interesting. So those are just some examples, but
that's great.
We're trying to figure it out as we go. So if people have ideas for how to do community engagement, I think cities are definitely open to hearing your ideas. We met with the city of San Jose, and that was a big topic of discussion, is how do we get different communities engaged? So they're open to hearing your ideas.
Yeah, I do think there's a real role to play in supporting a process which is challenging for cities and staff, and that we should all have the confidence that we're adding value to that process. But thank you for the examples. There's some great questions that are coming in. I'm just sorting through. I had one that was my favorite, and now there are new ones popping up. So there's a question, I think, about, I don't want you all to get too deep into this, but let's just touch on it because I think it's central to what a lot of people are thinking. There's a tension between the chronic need for more affordable housing everywhere and the importance and the prioritization of figuring out how to expand inclusivity through this process. We don't see those as intention, but I'm wondering if either both of you have a quick response to this question of, why are we adding all these layers that might make it harder to just build the stuff that we need wherever we can afford to build it?
I think ultimately they shouldn't be in tension, the idea that we want a more inclusive community and we want to build more affordable housing everywhere. And I definitely hear the complaint that this process is challenging of doing a housing element, but ultimately it should help us be able to approve more housing and more inclusive housing, because what we're doing is this kind of big long-term planning. Cities are going to have to do a lot of rezoning to have the capacity for all this affordable housing that we want to build. And once they do that rezoning, down the road, the approvals of actual projects should go much faster. If you've already zoned for, a building that will support an affordable housing development, and you don't have to do a general plan amendment, which can take, in places like Palo Alto, a couple of years. If you have a faster process, if you spend your process time in the planning process rather than in the responding to a proposal process, I think that's time better well spent as a staff, or time better spent as staff.
Thomas, is this one you can touch, or is it outside?
Sure.
Okay.
And I mean, I'll say, the vast majority of my job, I'm an advocate and a litigator, so the consulting piece is a relatively small piece of what I do in the end of the day. And these are issues that we grapple with frequently. I think there's a few different sort of principles at play that are helpful to think about. One is, and this is something that HUD memorialized in the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Rule, but it's that it's desirable to have what's often called either a both and or balanced approach, where you are simultaneously trying to increase opportunities in higher opportunity areas that may have been historically exclusionary. It's also important to try to prevent displacement in places that are feeling gentrification pressure. And it's also important to revitalize disinvested communities that may not be feeling as much of that immediate gentrification pressure. And that those goals are all complementary. And when you ignore one at the expense of one of the others, sometimes you can have really unhelpful unintended consequences. So for instance, if you neglect to try to build more affordable housing in higher opportunity areas, which may probably most frequently be in the context of mixed income housing that would also include a market rate component, whether you're talking about an inclusionary housing model or subsidized housing built by an affordable housing developer that is likewise mixed income, the lack of market rate production in higher opportunity areas can help increase demand in areas experiencing gentrification in ways that push people out. So, you have to be mindful of how these different pieces sort of interact with each other. With that said, it's not the case that the assessment of fair housing process is, entirely about housing production or entirely about zoning. There's a lot more to fair housing than that. And a lot of the things that need to be considered in any analysis are things that that kind of are really oriented towards increasing opportunity in low-income communities of color through investments in transportation and education, environmental remediation, also investments in or policy interventions to stabilize tenure in these places, not necessarily through new production, but sometimes through regulatory strategies. So, I think there's a lot to this discussion, and ultimately, when it comes down to the level of an individual family, families should have the choice of living in the neighborhood that perhaps they've called home for a long time and having it be a neighborhood of opportunity for them and a stable place to live, or moving to another place if they so choose and not having artificial constraints stand in the way.
Great. There's some general questions about the housing element and the RHNA process. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But while we're in this space, Thomas, can we talk a little bit about what a program or a kind of a regulatory rule means in this context? And let me just give you an example. There's a question of how do you enforce accessibility for folks with some type of disability that's been identified as potentially being a barrier for housing? What's the kind of thing that can be done locally to respond? And let me just, I think the question is, we've been, it's one thing to think about how you can't discriminate against people because of who they are, what their background is, or what their abilities are. How do we get from there to actually affirmatively furthering their rights in this kind of space?
Sure. I'll try to, in the interest of time, I'll try to sort of
you only got
a narrower sliver of the question. So okay. We're taking the idea, the issue of accessible housing as a starting point. There are, a few different legal regimes that relate to this. So the Fair Housing Act itself imposes design and construction requirements for multifamily housing built for occupancy from 1991 forward, so basically over the last 30 years. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 imposes accessibility requirements, including retrofit requirements on federally assisted housing, and that because of those retrofit requirements, that extends backwards as well. And then you also have the incorporation of accessibility requirements into local building code, and for tax credit housing, the incorporation of accessibility requirements into the QAP for tax credits. So there's lots of different ways of sort of addressing the accessibility issue legally. Some of those laws, but not all of them, allow private parties and people with disabilities who have accessibility needs, or disability services organizations who are trying to help their clients access housing, to sue under those laws, some but not all. When it comes to the standpoint of local action and what can local government be doing, I think there's a few things. So one is, and this is a continual source of frustration for me, regardless of where I'm working, is there's not great data on the existing supply of accessible housing. So, doing more to track what accessible housing exists, I think is a really valuable thing that jurisdictions could be doing. This is a type of thing that a jurisdiction could do through a rental registry program overall. There's obviously a lot of other potential uses of a rental registry, but one aspect of one could be to help in tracking the supply of accessible housing and what accessibility features it has. Another piece is that, it's obviously very important because the jurisdiction itself has a legal responsibility that if you are putting home or CDBG funds into a property, that the jurisdiction monitor its home and CDBG subrecipients to make sure that they're complying with Section 504's accessibility requirements. This is something where, for instance, the city of Los Angeles actually ended up entering into a over $1 billion consent decree over a sort of issue of, or it was contested, but an issue of lax oversight of its subrecipients' compliance with 504 a few years back. So, having the sort of compliance monitoring function really robust, and having staff who are trained and know how to and have the tools to do that compliance monitoring, I think is very important, because sometimes subrecipients, when left to their own devices, may either make innocent mistakes or may cut corners, and you may end up with violations of accessibility requirements. The last thing I'll say is that there's a really a role, and this relates to market rate housing, for building, permitting, and code enforcement type folks to play a role, even as new housing is being built, to make sure as early on in the process as possible that all of these laws are being complied with. It's obviously easier to fix an accessibility problem the earlier it is caught.
Kelsey, you want to just touch on how, what the kind of advocacy angle is on sort of how we translate into programs in through this process? I know you talked about that earlier. I just wanted to give you a chance to fill in that side of it.
Sure. So I think where we are at this stage in the game, at least in the Bay Area, we really need the most advocacy pushing cities to do the outreach that I already talked about. Once we get further down the road, we'll need advocates to do things around really kind of vetting sites to make sure that cities aren't kind of identifying sites that are unlikely to develop, or identifying sites that would maybe be, hazardous for affordable housing. So just making sure that the site inventory that cities are coming up with to say where housing is going to go, that is a good and valid list, and that it's distributed throughout the city in a fair way. So we'll need kind of volunteer support to do that. But specifically to the program and policy piece, I think just being involved in the process, getting together, with a coalition of people in your city and thinking about what are the policies that we need for the city to help prevent displacement of the community, or if you live in an exclusionary jurisdiction, what are the policies that we need to open up our community. But I think kind of tailoring it to the city is going to be really important, and just working in coalition. And then
Kelsey, could you tell us just roughly where we are? There's a question about timeline. The due date for all of this is the end of next year. Is there a kind of a rough sense of when drafts are going to be together?
Yeah, so yeah, the final copies are due to HCD in January of 2023. So I think we'll expect to see drafts maybe like spring of 2022. Potentially San Jose is on a different schedule, but I'm looking at Palo Alto's timeline right now, and they're thinking May and June of 2022 is when they'll have a draft out. And when those drafts are out, we'll also want to review the drafts, and that'll be another opportunity to advocate both for the policies that we want to see, but also the site selection that I touched on.
Great. So SV at Home has been working to try and track some of the timelines. We're going to drop a link in to get you on the mailing list, folks who are interested in that. I mean to cut you off, Kelsey. I'm just looking at my clock, trying to keep us respecting everybody's time. And the high level question that we still haven't answered, that a couple of people asked, is just the relationship between RHNA and the housing elements. So let me just talk about that a little bit. The RHNA is an obligation based on a calculation at the state level and then a regional level of what the housing needs are in our communities. And so each region and then each jurisdiction within those regions has been assigned a share of a much larger number, which is again an assessment of what the housing needs are in the state and in the region. The housing element process is the process that the cities go through to plan to respond to that allocation by having plans to accommodate that housing development within their cities. And so when we talk about RHNA numbers, what we're usually doing is saying you have a plan. These are the targets that you're supposed to be meeting. How well are you doing? And so the plan ideally helps to facilitate success in meeting the regional housing needs allocation requirements that each city is responsible for. I hope that captured that last one. There was a lot here. I really would encourage folks to sign up, and we're going to continue to share information. Thomas, Kelsey, I really appreciate your willingness to come and talk to us and try and ground us a little bit in the complexity of this stuff. It's really helpful to hear both the more legal framework, and Kelsey will plug folks in. Promise, we're going to get people targeted and active. So thank you everybody for coming. Let me turn the floor over to, I believe, Allison, who will take us out.
All right, folks. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Kelsey and Thomas. You guys have been a great great presenters and a great audience. So just to remind everyone, we are a membership organization. So if you found today's discussion on fair housing and the housing element to be valuable, we encourage you to join us as a member. When you join us via home, we can leverage our resources, magnify our voices, and advance strategic collaborative solutions to California's affordable housing crisis that meet our local and regional needs. If we can just drop that link in the chat, you can join today at bit.ly/SVH member. We will be following up with a recording of this event that we'll email to all attendees. So if you would like to review and get some more great information out of that, you will have the opportunity to do that. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.